Dreaming of blissful summer days and creamy popsicles? Capture sun-drenched memories with the Orange Vanilla Dream Hydration Multiplier from Liquid IV. Just one stick and 16 ounces of water can help hydrate you better than water alone. Live your summer dream with Liquid IV. Tear, pour, live more. Go to liquidiv.com and get 20% off your first order with code INDULGE20 at checkout.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
So a lot can change in a very short time in this economy. My name is Mike Eppel. It was about a month ago in this space that we were talking about the outlook for interest rates for the summertime. And at that point, a mere 3 or 4 weeks ago, the discussion was that the Bank of Canada this month would likely be cutting interest rates. At the time, it was thought that the tariff and trade war and all these other things going on would be tanking the economy, and we'd need lower interest rates or interest rate relief. Of course, it did come back to inflationary data, but a funny thing's happened over the course of the summertime. The June unemployment statistics were much better than forecast, 83,000 jobs added. You can argue about the vagaries of the monthly data points on employment, but overall the numbers weren't bad, and a 6.9% unemployment rate. And inflation has remained, well, elevated, 1.9% on the headline for June to almost 3% or thereabouts for the core reading on inflation. So now, when the Bank of Canada sets policy on July 30th, not much chance they're going to cut interest rates. To talk about it, though, and try to figure out what's next and whether or not the Bank of Canada should still be thinking about an interest rate cut, Royce Mendes is joining me. He's the managing director and head of macro strategy at Desjardins. Hello there, Royce.
Hi, Mike.
So, yeah, it's been an interesting summer. It's always interesting in the world of economics because we're so fixated on the data points. And this year, you could argue more so than ever, the Trump factor has been in full effect. And trying to figure out, how this is all going to play out, it's been a situation of pencil and eraser on some of the best days. But look, let's face it. A month ago, we were looking at the likelihood of interest rates coming down, and now that's pretty much off the table. What's your take, and what, to your mind, has changed?
Well, the data just aren't providing a clear picture for the Bank of Canada. As you said, the unemployment rate did come down apparently, and I say apparently because the labor force survey is extremely volatile and at times unreliable. The economy created about 85,000 jobs in June. Now, if we take that at face value, maybe that's signaling a reacceleration in the economy, and the Bank of Canada can say, okay, our job is done. I'm more skeptical than that. I would say that if we take a step back and we look at the data more holistically, you see an unemployment rate at still 6.9%. That means that there are significantly more people looking for jobs and without a job than there are typically when the economy is at full health. You look at other data points, the manufacturing sector, wholesale, retailing. These things are showing signs that the economy is likely to have been very stagnant in the second quarter and potentially in the third quarter as well. We don't have a whole lot of data for June or July just yet. The only data point we really have is that labor force survey. And so, that's why I say it's providing conflicting signals. The latest data point says that we may be reaccelerating, but we know that we have to take that with a huge grain of salt. But the data points that are more reliable but more lagged are suggesting that the economy is very slow and possibly contracting. That's not going to be enough for the Bank of Canada, I think, to cut later this month, but it sets up, I think, for the Bank of Canada to re-engage their cutting cycle later this year, so long as inflationary pressures recede. But that's a big if at this point.
Well, you could make the argument that the Bank of Canada has been slow on the uptake on a few occasions. And I'm talking specifically, okay, what happened during COVID, pre and post, so to speak, and now in the midst of a trade war. And yes, they're focused on the monthly data points, but should they not be more intuitive, I suppose, of the fact that the economy under the surface. When you hear anecdotal evidence from the household sector, the demands or frustration for households that interest rates haven't come down, and just the day-to-day signals that they should be basically saying, yeah, we're going to cut, in advance of what we think. 0.25% is not going to do that much, but it might help more than it would hurt.
I would agree with that contention. But I think from the bank's point of view, they're worried about inflation because inflation is their single mandate. They're not like the U.S. Federal Reserve that has a dual mandate, focuses on the employment side and inflation. Their sole mandate is to keep inflation at 2% within a range of 1% to 3%, accounting for some volatility. That being said, the core inflation numbers that they focus on are at about 3%, maybe a little bit above 3%. So that's problematic. But I would agree with your point, because when I look at those core inflation numbers, I see problems with them. There were one big spike in April that is causing them to remain elevated. And that April number to me looks like a real outlier driven by a bunch of one-time factors. But for a central banker that has just been through COVID and still has the scars of that elevated inflation, I think their point would be we'd rather be safe than sorry on inflation, because if we let inflation go, it will be really painful to bring back down. I'm willing to be a little bit more forward looking. I would say that if I look at tariffs, yes, they might increase prices a little bit more this summer, but they'll really be one-time price level shifts higher, and they won't turn into sustainable inflation, particularly because the unemployment rate is elevated. The economy is underperforming its potential. There's not a lot of room for households or businesses, for that matter, to absorb a lot more price or cost increases. This is not like COVID, when people had a lot of cash in their bank accounts. Even businesses were holding elevated levels of cash at that time. It's a very different environment. But the bank's not willing to make that leap of faith right now. But I do think, as I said, as we get through the year, I think they'll get more comfortable with that idea.
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, keeping interest rates higher to slow consumer spending is one thing. The inflation isn't exactly being caused by a strong consumer segment, is it? Like, that's the counter argument. It's like they're dealing with something, again, this black swan event, whatever you want to call it, but something that they haven't dealt with in the past, and using metrics based on supply and demand might not really work in this case.
I'd agree with you, and I'll put it in this way, in a way that, in an example that they've been really inconsistent. So they're looking at the core inflation numbers, but you actually cited the headline inflation number, which is a little bit below the 2% target. Why is it below? Because of the elimination of the carbon tax. Well, that's a one-time price level shift lower, but the bank is saying we're going to look through that. But to your point, tariffs, in theory, should be one-time price level shifts higher. So why shouldn't we look through that as well? So they're picking and choosing a little bit what they want to be worried about and what they want to give more weight to. And, in my opinion, I think you may want to give tariffs a little bit more weight, but not that much. And now we've been having a headline inflation rate below 2% for a few months now. I think, you and I sitting here in Toronto, we definitely feel that discount at the gas station when we go to fill up from the removal of the carbon tax. I think that is, for us, lower inflation than would have otherwise been the case. Why aren't they taking that into account as much as the tariffs? I don't know.
Yeah.
They are.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think they're just worried about what happened during COVID, and it may be a case, if we look at this a few years from now, of the Bank of Canada fighting the last war, rather than looking ahead and seeing what's coming down the pike.
Does the demographic breakdown of who is feeling the most stress in the economy right now matter at all? This report in earlier this week about consumer debt levels, people living paycheck to paycheck, $200 away from insolvency. Younger Canadians, consistently, we're talking about a youth session right now, a 20% unemployment rate for certain segments. The upper echelon, sure, the wealthier, the older segment of society, it's doing okay. But does that disparity weigh into anything at this point where they say, yeah, a lot of people do need a break?
So you've opened up a whole can of worms here. One, the really big picture answer is that the Bank of Canada has a very blunt tool to move interest rates up or down. So they can't really look at different demographics or look at different regions or different industries of the economy. They have to look at the economy as a whole. The numbers that you provide sound terrifying, but I am always skeptical of those sorts of surveys, because if you look back in time to times when the economy may have been better off, there is always a significant portion, like 50% of the population, that says that they are within $200 of, significant financial challenges or missing their debt payments. Why is that? Well, because people generally do. I mean, a big part of this country lives paycheck to paycheck. The key metric to watch is the unemployment rate. If the unemployment rate is higher than it needs to be or is rising, then those people will fall behind on the debt payments. If the unemployment rate is low, then those people won't, because they're still employed and they're not gonna have to draw down on whatever little savings they may have. They'll keep getting their paycheck. In this economy, there is 6.9% of the workforce that is looking for work. That is elevated. And in this economy, maybe we should pay attention a little bit more to those types of statistics that you're citing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I am worried about the unemployment rate remaining this high for too long, where people start to get discouraged about finding work. One thing I will say is that right now there's not a lot of job separation. So people aren't being fired or let go in very large numbers. This is happening in some industries and some people, but in aggregate, it's not happening in a huge way. What is happening is that people who are looking for work are just not finding jobs. This could be that people who are slowly losing work as a result of being let go, or it could be, to your point, young people, students graduating from college, university, high school, looking for work, new immigrants coming into the country looking for work. It is very hard for someone to find a job if they're looking. And I would say that I'm worried that some people will get discouraged. We saw this after the financial crisis in the U.S. You saw a lot of people become discouraged about the labor market, and it really scarred the economy in the U.S. for some time.
I'm still wondering when, all of the headlines so far this summer, really, from the labor market, you've got Ontario colleges, 10,000 jobs lost, the auto sector losing jobs and putting workers on furlough, the retail sector, and it raises questions. And I think there were some Spockian eyebrows raised when StatsCan put out that, jobs print for June at 83,000. Look, I don't know where you stand on this, but there are some who think that we're already in a recession, and the second half of this year is going to crater, pending, of course, trade talks and a trade deal. Maybe not August 1st.
Yeah, I don't know about recession. I would say we're in a very stagnant economy, and given the fact that we, continue to grow the size of the population, albeit very slowly now relative to prior years, the productive capacity of the economy continues to grow. And so we are undershooting every month that productive capacity by more and more and more. And that should be putting downward pressure on inflation. And so when I talk about these core numbers that the Bank of Canada looks at, they are somewhat more technical and sophisticated than I think they need to be. The U.S. Federal Reserve doesn't use these types of core measures of inflation. They don't use a trimmed mean or a median to look at core inflation. They just use good old-fashioned ex-food and energy inflation. And some of these measures suggest different things. The bank is really focused on those core measures, but if we take signals from the economy itself, there shouldn't really be that many inflationary pressures right now. And if whatever is pushing it up is probably tariff related and one time, I think the Bank of Canada can begin to shift its gaze back to the economy a little bit later this year, assuming that that does prove to be true, that those price pressures from tariffs are one time.
Yeah. Okay. So let's look forward to the end of this month, July 30th, they're going to set rates. Interestingly, the Fed's going to do the same on the same day. And the Fed's got its other issues right now between Trump and Powell and what have you. But no, if, let's say, we're into the last week of this month and there are signals put out by the Carney government and Trump that we are nowhere near a deal on trade and 35% tariffs look likely on August 1st, not to mention the other tariffs already in place, does the Bank of Canada look at that and go, we got to cut? Whatever, regardless of what the last economic statistics show.
I would say no. I would say no because I'm, reading the tea leaves here and looking at their reaction function, not maybe what I would do if I was sitting in that seat, but their reaction function seems to be, we're not going to cut in the face of tariffs, because if Canada imposes more retaliatory tariffs on the US, then that's going to lead to higher prices. And that is what they are really focused on and worried about. Whether that is right or wrong, that's not the question you asked me. But I will say that that is the way they will interpret that, in my opinion. They won't be cutting if trade talks fall apart. They'll be worried about the price impacts of thicker borders, higher tariff rates, retaliatory tariffs, all of those things.
Yeah. So much for the summer being a quiet time. It used to be we just look forward to the Jackson Hole Fed Symposium in August, and that was about it.
Right. Well, I mean, Powell's got a lot of things on his plate.
He might not even be there at that point. Anyway, thank you, Royce. It was good talking to you.
My pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me.
And that was Royce Mendes, Managing Director and Head of Macro Strategy at Desjardins. Hey, thanks for listening to In This Economy. My name is Mike Eppel. And if you want to give feedback or comments or story ideas, you can email me at mike.eppel, EPPEL, at rci.rogers.com. On social, I'm at Epman. That's EPPMAN. And a reminder to listen to other frequency podcast product like The Big Story or The Roz Mocha Show or what have you on the Seeker app. That's SEEKR, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Again, thanks for listening.